morning. So a very warm welcome to the 5th of our Lent lectures. Lovely to see some familiar faces and also some new people, and that's just great. My name's Helen Painter. I'm director of the Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence, which is based in Bristol, but has an international network now of people working in the twin areas of the interpretation of biblical violence and the ways that the Bible is weaponized. And we both do academic research and aim to produce resources that are useful for the churches. And if you're not familiar with our work, you might like to have a little look at our website, which is csbvbristol.org.uk. Let me introduce our speaker for this evening, and I'm absolutely delighted that Steve Hucklesby has agreed at quite short notice to step in and speak for us. He's an advisor specialising in foreign and defence policy for the Joint Public Issues Team. And if you haven't heard of the Joint Public Issues Team, it's a partnership between the Baptist Union of Great Britain, the Methodist Church and the United Reformed Church in the UK. Steve provides policy analysis for JPIT around intervention in conflict, human rights and international aid. He's also a member of the Council on Christian Approaches to Defence and Disarmament and has research interests in nuclear non-proliferation, the ethics of remote warfare and casualty recording in conflict. He's previously managed relief and refugee programmes for an NGO working as an implementing partner of the UNHCR, High Commission for Refugees. So Steve, we'll pray in a moment before we start, but thank you so much and a very warm welcome.
Well, thank you for that very full and warm introduction, and it's a delight to be with you.
Thank you. Now, those who are regular will know that I set myself the challenge of finding a different Christian tradition each time to offer a prayer for peace. And so today we're going to use a prayer from George Fox, who was the founder, as I'm sure you know, of the Quaker movement. I thought you'd like that, Judy. So would you pray with me? Grant us, O Lord, blessing of those whose minds are stayed on you, so that we may be kept in perfect peace, a peace which cannot be broken. Let not our minds rest upon any creature, but only in the Creator, not upon goods, things, houses, lands, inventions of vanities or foolish fashions, lest our peace being broken, we become cross and brittle and given over to envy. From all such, deliver us, O God, and grant us your peace. Amen. So I'm delighted to hand over to you, Steve. Perhaps I could ask other members of the audience to mute themselves. I will now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What an appropriate prayer to open with from the Quaker tradition. Absolutely delighted to be with you, to be joining in this lecture series titled Things That Make for Peace. I'm going to share some thinking with you on issues that seem to me to be pertinent with respect to Ukraine. I look forward to getting your reaction and for us having some discussion together. So just to let you know where I think I'm going, I'll reflect on some of the Russian action and resort to violence. I'm going to reflect on a Ukrainian response to that, on sanctions, also on some of the justifications given for violence, and also then on the nuclear threat. That's quite a range of issues. Here's a spoiler alert. The theme possibly running through all of this is that things that make for peace, I think, need to be worked out in a time of peace. Once we get to a time of crisis, working out the things that make for peace become an awful lot more difficult. I come at this as a person who's worked around conflict, who's studied international relations, and has an interest in theology, but I would suggest that I'm a rather dangerous amateur in that field. Coming on to Ukraine, I think we all respond to this conflict with a sense of sadness, with horror and with distress. There are reports of so far possibly 10,000 Russian soldiers killed in this conflict. Numbers of Ukrainian civilians killed are not known. It's certainly going to be higher than the 1,700, which I've last seen reported, confirmed by the United Nations. Then we've got 4 million Ukrainians who have so far sought refuge in neighboring countries and elsewhere in Europe. In terms of a crisis in Europe, it's unprecedented in recent times. Let me touch briefly on that aspect of refugees, because our churches have many members who are ready to welcome Ukrainian refugees into their homes. This outpouring of goodwill is quite heartening, I find. Unfortunately, the mechanisms put in place thus far for the application for people to come to this country seem rather overburdensome, especially for people who've got limited access to computers at this time. Yet they're required to send documents not only in electronic form, but as PDFs. The government said it wants to be open and facilitating to Ukrainians. Sadly, as churches, we're not seeing enough evidence of that facilitation at the moment. And our church leaders are in discussions daily at the moment with the Home Office and with the Department for Levelling Up to try and work this out. It seems, as I say, quite challenging to talk about the things that make for peace while we're still in the thick of conflict, while we're seeing apartment blocks still being shelled, with thousands who are suffering at the moment trauma of grief, trauma of injury, or seeing the neighborhoods destroyed. While it may be difficult to talk about things that make for peace at the time, nevertheless, I think it is an absolutely necessary framing for our biblical reflection on this conflict. I remember in 2006, the URC Methodist churches were tasked to put together a report post-Iraq. It wasn't quite post-Iraq. Iraq was still very much a hot war in 2006. The working group published Peacemaking, a Christian Vocation. So again, in the midst of this intervention in Iraq, in which tens of thousands died, we placed our consideration conflict firmly within the wider framework of peacemaking. I just want to say something about approaching this conflict with a sense of humility. I'd say that when any war breaks out, as Christians, we first have to approach the situation with a healthy dose of humility. We live in a fallen world where, sadly, we've not been able to address a culture of violence. In particular, we've not been able to overcome the use of violence or the threat of use of violence as a key means of statecraft in the relations between states. Even our biblical text provides us a witness to violence and war, particularly in the Old Testament. But at the same time, there's a thread all the way through affirming that God looks forward to a time when violence will be no more. Isaiah looks forward to a time when the infant will play near the cobra's den and the young child will put its hand into the viper's nest. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. We hold on to this promise of the fulfillment of God's plan. We're hopeful that through God's grace, our world might be filled with the knowledge of God. But we do so recognizing that we are a long way from this today. I'll make it clear that I see the invasion, obviously, by Russia as wholly wrong, but I first want to suggest that when we see what Russia has done in Ukraine, we are particularly aware of the human condition. Pope Francis has said, every war leaves our world worse than it was before. War is a failure of politics and humanity, a shameful capitulation, a stinging defeat before the forces of evil. So I'm coming to this topic then with a degree of humility, with sorrow, and with an appeal to God for forgiveness. In our churches, local, national, and international, we've been working on active peace building, working on what non-violence looks like and whether it can ever be seen as a realistic alternative to war. The Vatican, for example, has been working at on a theologically informed understanding of non-violence. And Pope Francis, in the encyclical Fratelli Tutti, is quite critical of an over-reliance on just war framing in response to conflict, a reliance maybe which has been a part of the Catholic tradition. I'm going to come now to Ukraine, the actions of the Russian Federation and decisions of President Putin. How have we got to where we are today? The concerns of the government of the Russian Federation are around the creeping influence of NATO in its near neighborhood. The claim of NATO countries that all countries should be free to become a member of NATO if they meet the conditions is rather simplistic and stark. It's based on a widely held understanding in the West that NATO is a defensive alliance. It's intrinsically defensive in nature, but let's take a step back from that. Let's put ourselves in the shoes of someone who, through their own local and historical experience, a Russian citizen maybe, is concerned about a hegemonic and expansionist neoliberalism that seeks to export its agendas to states that have quite different political cultures and histories. If you're coming from this perspective, you may perceive NATO as the military muscle behind this expansionist neoliberalism. Now NATO no longer looks quite so benign. The perception of these things is in the eye of the beholder. In 2008, George Bush backed a call for both Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO. His call at the time was contentious, even among some NATO partners. Since then, both Georgia and Ukraine have suffered Russian invasion. In saying this, I'm not in any way trying to explain or excuse Putin's action in Ukraine, only that we appear to be quite poor at appreciating how our own security posture is perceived by Russia and vice versa. This is in spite of the intensely skilled diplomatic work that goes on constantly behind the scenes, work to which the UK usefully contributes. Yet at some level, our perceptions of an adversary and how they perceive us remains poor. And I think there's serious work to be done here moving forward. I'm going to come on now to Putin's decision to go to war and recall some of the statements he made about this prior to the invasion. He appeared to give three different grounds that might justify, in his mind, the need for an invasion of Ukraine. Firstly, the supposed genocide taking place in the Donbass region. Secondly, the Russian government view that the government of Ukraine are neo-Nazi fascists and that therefore Russia is helping to hold back the forces of violent fascism to the benefit of all of Europe. And then thirdly, that a proper reading of the history of Ukraine is that the people of Ukraine are part of a greater Rus, and that therefore the Russian Federation has some moral authority to determine how they are ruled and protected. Now, even if these arguments were credible, none of them provide a basis under international law for intervention. The allegation of genocide has to be tested independently, and all other means exhausted before a military action in the cause of humanitarianism by another state can be proposed. The third argument put forward by Putin, the claim of a greater Rus, is precisely the scenario the great powers at the end of the Second World War were keen to avoid. They were particularly keen to avoid this in the context of the region of Europe when establishing the United Nations. And so you've got the United Nations articles, Charter, Article 2 with the inviolability of states. And it was specifically to guard against these, the possibility of invasion on the basis of another state's national interest or identity. So I'd argue that whatever we may think about the United States and UK intervention in either Serbia or in Iraq, the Russian violation of the UN Charter is much more blatant and self-serving than, and in that respect, is a greater threat to the international order on which we all rely. In the build-up to the invasion, the governments of the United States, European states, and NATO, and the Ukrainian army were careful not to give Russia any pretext for initiating an invasion. The decision to invade was entirely down to President Putin. We don't know when he made this decision. Possibly this action had formed in his mind, not months, but some years ago. Vladimir Putin is so secretive that some in his cabinet were surprised by the decision to launch an attack on Kiev just weeks before some were certain that such an attack would not happen. Thinking biblically, and I will try to do so at various points. I've given a lot of my analysis on the conflict situation so far. Thinking biblically, maybe this begs the question around a biblical understanding of power. Regarding the power of President Putin within the context of Russian politics is maybe a special case, but we could also ask questions about the exercise of power in democracies, for example, following the tenure of Donald Trump in the United States. What are the biblical principles that help us to grapple with important principles around public service in government, around the authority and limits on authority of national leaders? Our states today, whether democratic or less so, operate in political cultures that are very different from the biblical times. So we cannot expect to see parallels that we can simply lift out of the Bible that would relate to our situation today. And this is where I would look to others with more skills than myself to help us with this. So that's, I think, a brief analysis of the Russian side to the invasion. Now I'm going to come to the Ukrainian response. We, as Christians, I hope, are always striving to build a world of peace and non-violence. But even so, this may not prevent us from standing in solidarity with Ukrainians who are fighting for their freedom. Building peace is largely, to my mind, what we do before fighting and before war breaks out, and what we do afterwards. I've got respect for a purely pacifist position. Non-violent actions to address injustice and military attack need to be explored more. And we can look at some contexts already of non-violent resistance in Palestine, in Sierra Leone, non-violent tools used in Colombia, and we can learn quite usefully. But non-violent resistance in Ukraine, I think, would lead to a prolonged Russian military occupation, followed by a Russian-backed government in Ukraine that would then be, for a very long time, subservient to Moscow. The just war tradition permits defense against an aggressor as long as the intention is the restoration of justice and peace. One can argue that in this particular conflict, the need to confront a violent aggressor is a requirement of justice in order that oppression and violence can be stopped in its tracks. Most subscribers to just war would say that the classic just war tradition, in this tradition, there is a presumption against violence. However, there are exceptional occasions when a military response to aggression becomes a requirement in order to punish the wrongdoer and restore justice. We might hear maybe in our ears the calls of President Zelensky directed towards the governments of European nations when he says, if Russia is not stopped by Ukrainians in Ukraine, then where will Russia go next? There's much more that could be said on just war and just peace, and maybe that's something to pick up in questions, because I'd like a little bit of time to reflect on two other aspects which I think are pertinent to this crisis in Ukraine. And that is, firstly, sanctions, and then secondly, the nuclear threat. And I'm going to talk a bit about sanctions, not only because I'm interested in sanctions per se, I am, but my interest doesn't stop them. I'm also interested in a discussion around the context of sanctions in the totality of our economic relationships, and the question about how we perceive an ethical economic relationship, particularly relationships between states. I want then to reflect on the question of things that make for peace, not only in terms of economic relationships in times of war, but economic relationships at other times too. In the past few weeks, we've seen a fundamental transformation in our economic relationship with Russia. In recent years, President Putin has built up a war chest of foreign currency reserves. Going into this conflict, he almost certainly thought that he'd be able to cope with any sanctions that Europe, the United States, and others might levy on Russia. He had reasonable expectations that there probably would be sanctions on Russian banks, that there would be further sanctions on oligarchs and on members of the government, that there would probably be a disconnection of some banks from the SWIFT system that would make their relationships with banks and countries elsewhere extremely difficult. Maybe what he didn't expect was the full extent of the sanctions regime that we have in place at the moment. And to be honest, nor did we. He probably didn't expect the sanctioning of the Russian central bank that limits access to foreign currency reserves. He probably thought that on balance, the suspension of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline was unlikely. He probably didn't expect the withdrawal of hundreds of international companies and brand names from Russia who have been investing in the Russian economy, and with this withdrawal, the consequent loss of jobs. Now, the term economic warfare has sometimes been used to describe the sanctions regime. It's been used, for example, in articles from the Brookings Institute, the Council on Foreign Relations, New York Times, Reuters, and others. I understand why sanctions are described as economic warfare, but the warfare analogy doesn't sit easily with me. Using the warfare analogy, you can ask the question as to whether Russians who have lost their jobs are justifiable, if you like, collateral damage in this conflict. You could ask a question using the warfare analogy whether in some way they, ordinary Russians, are directly culpable for the actions of their state. Other analogies with warfare, sanctions is designed to have political effect. And in this sense, they have a role in both deterrence as well as compellence, two concepts that are key to warfare. Also, Russian government officials have made statements questioning whether the purpose of sanctions are to destroy Russia. So there's a perception maybe from their side that sanctions could be equated with warfare. But for me, it doesn't sit easily for two reasons. Firstly, I perceive sanctions as a form of coercion that provides an alternative to military action, an alternative to warfare. Sanctions are one of the non-violent measures that could be part of a just peace framing. Yes, sanctions cause damage, but the nature of the damage is intrinsically different to that of weapons of war that are designed to kill. I think it's important to maintain that distinction. Secondly, I feel that sanction policies raise important questions about the nature of our economic relationships. Since our sanctions against Russia went into effect, we've been forced to ask ourselves why we have allowed so much Russian money to be invested in property in London, sometimes with very little transparency. The UK government has said it intends to tackle this area. UK government has promised to launch a public beneficial ownership register for UK property since 2016. Groups such as Church and Action on Tax Justice have called for such a register. But the UK government hasn't shown itself to be very enthusiastic over this, and 5 years on, we still do not have a register of beneficial ownership, either of property or of trusts. Our economic systems across the world are structured that capital should be allowed to flow freely across international borders and with a minimum of interference. Shareholders and other sources of capital can then freely maximize profits and growth. Under this model, economic activity is an intrinsic social good, as long as it's not invested in activities that are illegal. These free market ideals are beginning to be questioned by the climate crisis and the need for economic activity to have long-term sustainability. Although we have significant difficulties with governments such as Russia around human rights or international law, successive UK governments have nevertheless been keen to maximize our trading relationship with Russia. Also with Saudi Arabia, other governments that we've got significant difficulties with on ethical and human rights grounds. So how do we think about this biblically? How do we perceive a just trading relationship? We could look to maybe natural law philosophers for an ethical argument. We could go back to Aquinas. We find that he makes a distinction between the ownership of property and its benefit to society. He says property should be in private possession, but in common use. Looking biblically at this, when Jesus saw an elderly woman put 2 small copper coins into the collection, he said, "Truly this woman has put into the treasury more than all the others." Her donation amounted to a fraction of a denarius, but Jesus saw the value of the coins not in terms of what they could buy, but in terms of where they came from. In this respect, money represents an exchange. Jesus was pointing out the relational element of that exchange, where it comes from, where it's going to, and what it represents. So coming back to the question of sanctions as economic warfare, I'm resisting this because I feel if we choose not to invest in Russian gas, we are simply choosing not to contribute to Russian treasury. If that is our choice, then I see that not as an act of war, but as an act of responsibility. It may not always be seen in that way, but this is probably because we're not sufficiently questioning the political implications of our trading relationships in times of peace, and beginning then only to question them in times of war, when we are pulled up short. We could come back onto that, but I'm going to move us on next to the nuclear question, because I think the nuclear threat has been discussed quite a bit in the media recently. I feel we've got to be careful here. On the one hand, the nuclear threat cannot be ignored, but on the other hand, the implications of a nuclear war are so frightening that for some people, even talking about this possibility can cause anxiety, and maybe even in some cases affect mental health. President Putin, at the beginning of this conflict, put his nuclear weapons on alert. We don't know what that means quite. It may mean very little. It's primarily a mechanism for Putin to signal his resolve and his preparedness to be tough. But could such a crisis lead actually to the use of nuclear weapons? The Russian nuclear doctrine states that the purpose of Russia's nuclear weapons is to defend against an attack on the Russian Federation or its allies when the very existence of the state is under threat. Interestingly, a similar statement is used by the UK in terms of our own nuclear doctrine. And yet I would suggest that although the doctrines sound similar, the threshold for use of nuclear weapons by Russia is probably somewhat lower. Maybe this can be seen, for example, in the statements that have been made in advance of the invasion and since. So we have statements from President Joe Biden and from Western allies been designed to counter any notion that we are in a time of nuclear crisis at this stage. One of the difficulties we have in the UK, though, is, in common with other NATO allies, is that we don't rule out the first use of nuclear weapons. Now, it's probably the case that our threshold for the use of nuclear weapons, as I suggest, is very much lower than the threshold of first use by Russia. But even so, by not ruling out the first use of nuclear weapons, it creates for the UK, I believe, both an ethical dilemma and a strategic dilemma. The ethical dilemma is that we apply then to the use of weapons of mass destruction a form of consequential ethics that instrumentalizes the weapon and its effects. We assert that due to their capacity to kill indiscriminately, nuclear weapons can, in certain extreme circumstances, be justified as a lesser of two evils. And it then becomes the capacity of nuclear weapons to kill indiscriminately that we as nuclear weapons states begin to prize. And the states themselves, they will argue that this isn't the case. They use the doctrine of double effect to support this argument. But for me, this argument is really difficult to sustain. Secondly, we've got a strategic dilemma here. And that is that by not ruling out the first use of nuclear weapons, we add value to the weapons themselves. I'm particularly concerned about this doctrine of first use. In the case of nuclear weapons, this works against the UK's government's stated aim of the universalization of the non-proliferation treaty and of nuclear disarmament. The government's unwavering support for nuclear deterrence compromises our support for nuclear disarmament simply because it does add value to the weapons themselves. Holding out the possibility of first use adds value to such an extent that the hope for progressive nuclear disarmament becomes vanishingly small, if not non-existent. Value is further added with the spending on nuclear weapons, eye-watering sums of money that is spent on systems and the development of new warheads. Now, the statements of government, including our own, on progressive nuclear armaments, when coupled with this investment of money, begins to resemble then the emperor's new clothes, so to speak. I'm hoping that sometime some young boy or girl might point out that maintaining support for first use of nuclear weapons would suggest strips the emperor naked. A couple of biblical reflections here. The UK states that we might use nuclear weapons first when in fact this possibility is extremely unlikely. Yet Jesus said, "Let your yes be yes and your no be no." Is this statement from Jesus not about integrity? Our policy, though, of calculated ambiguity in nuclear weapons is designed to signal to a handful of nuclear policy specialists who, in the case in Russia, who may be currently in a nuclear bunker in Moscow. But more importantly, our nuclear policy and our statements around nuclear weapons has to make sense to someone on the streets of Tehran or Beijing, or indeed a citizen on the streets of Moscow. And I think that it doesn't make sense to them. A further biblical reflection on this, Israel is described in the Old Testament as a model to the nations. Now, I'm probably on dodgy ground here if I extend this model of the nations too far. But just reflect that the purpose of being a model is to pursue and demonstrate what you perceive and believe to be right. And so if your view is that you shouldn't use nuclear weapons in the context of first use, because that is almost certainly wrong, then why can we not let our yes be yes, our no be no, and adopt that as our policy? If, on the other hand, we're holding out the possibility that there may be circumstances in which the first use of nuclear weapons is permissible, then we're into a really complex difficulty of what might those circumstances be. And that is always going to be a subjective judgment that we're never going to be able to resolve with, how do I say, people on the streets of Moscow or Beijing. In some of the statements that have been made around nuclear weapons in this conflict, I have been encouraged. There was an interview with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. He was challenged to explain what the NATO response might be to Putin's readiness of his nuclear weapons. Rather than addressing that question directly, Stoltenberg instead chose to remind us of the Gorbachev-Reagan dictum that was agreed together between Putin and Biden just last year, that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. So pouring cold water on a discussion around the circumstances in which nuclear weapons could possibly be used in this conflict. Let me now, because I'm running out of time, just sum up. I started with the suggestion that things that make for peace are primarily things that we need to concentrate on in times of peace and in times after war, and are much more difficult when conflict breaks out. Consequently, I think it's really critical that we build up a toolbox of mechanisms for putting in place a just peace in our world. And that we need to work on this every day and not just in times of crisis. A just peace involves a range of practices and disciplines. Members of all faith groups have a role to play. It's really helpful when we can come together with other faiths. In many places, religious leaders can be valuable facilitators in a just peace. In many places, they may well be trusted as intermediaries within their communities. With their support, just peace practices involve a range of different practices. They might include promotion of non-violent practices and strategies around times of tension and conflict, of non-violent resistance in conflict, of unarmed civilian protection, of accompaniment. We might think here of, for example, of the ecumenical accompaniment program in Palestine and Israel, of strengthening systems for restorative justice, of putting in place mechanisms for trauma counseling and healing, both on a personal and also on a communal level. In conflict-sensitive situations, a just peace means a cross-community dialogue of a problem-solving exercise across communities and with different interest groups. What might a just peace mean in the Ukrainian context? I think I'm not quite sure at this point. However, I reflect that many of our denominations have churches in Ukraine and in Russia, and that in some cases, some of these churches come under unified church leadership across both countries. Where that is the case, there are strains in that relationship at this point in time, and I'd ask you to pray for Russian church leaders as well as Ukrainian church leaders at this time. Russian church leaders at the moment are under immense stress, particularly where they feel a pastoral responsibility for churches both in Russia and in Ukraine. Our churches together must be a part of whatever comes next after this conflict. Dialogue within churches in Russia has been difficult historically. The dialogue around issues of politics and national security within churches in Russia is particularly difficult. So then we need to reflect on how we can develop a dialogue in churches in Russia and in Ukraine that is maybe focused on biblical approaches to addressing violence. We may find it difficult to see eye to eye, given our national and political diversity within those churches. And I want to draw, I think, our attention to what I think is a very brave and important theological statement made by leaders of the ecumenical Orthodox family in just a couple of weeks ago, that seeks to encourage dialogue and exchange with the Russian Orthodox Church. In this statement, they address the concept of a greater Rus and the impact on the Orthodox family. They say that this has been utilized to support the ethnic organization of the church. This ethnic organization of the church, they say, is against Orthodox unity. They say specifically on this concept of a greater Rus and its impact on the church, that if we hold such false principles as valid, then the Orthodox Church ceases to be the church of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the apostles, the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, and the ecumenical councils and the fathers of the church. It splits the sense of Orthodox unity and our subscription to one gospel under Christ. At the very basic level, biblical values should be a place in which we find common ground. I think I'll leave it there, but maybe in questions we might want to reflect on how that biblical common ground could play out as we move forward to build relationships after this conflict. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Steve. You've given us such a lot to think about. I was wildly typing notes as you were speaking, and I think I should be going back and listening again. I've got many questions myself, but I'm confident that there will be many in the audience who've got questions. So let me just expand my screen a little bit so I can see you better. And does anybody like to kick off? If not, I can go first. Let me ask you then, going back to an early point you made about the presumption that NATO is based on, that it's inherently defensive, and the way that that's perceived on the other side of the border there. I was reflecting on the statement by Patriarch Kirill immediately prior to the invasion, where he spoke very much in terms of Russia's prospective action as in defensive terms, even though it's visibly aggressive. And I was reflecting on that as a kind of classic tactic of reversal of victim and offender. And I was wondering if you would comment on that.
Certainly, there's an element of that, but my question is, to what extent is that deliberately purposed as an argument? So I'm not sure that Bishop Kirill is deliberately manipulating an argument for effect. I think that another interpretation of this might be in the way in which there is a Russian psyche, maybe, that is developed from historical experience and from their perspective of national identity. So there is a sense of Russia's relationship and dominance within the region, and a sense that that's somehow already been taken away from them. There's also a sense in that Russia historically has always had to be strong to defend itself from various types of invasion, and has a sense of needing to rise strongly at times of crisis that has developed from an external source. All of this then goes to, I think, explain the arguments that are then made in the context of Ukraine. But what we see is we only look at those arguments today and interpret them today at face value and on the basis of our understanding of the threat that Russia faces, which in our understanding would be very little. But you then have to put yourselves in the shoes, not necessarily of an educated 18-year-old Russian who has been educated in the West, but of your average Russian who has been born and bred and grown up in the context of a Russian experience and psyche, which is very different.
Thank you. That's a really helpful response. Anybody else like to ask anything? I can't see you all at once, so if I don't spot a hand, then do feel free to call out. Okay, well, I'm just going to keep going then. I've got loads of questions. Something that I reflect on quite a bit, to absolutely no forward movement in my reflections on this at all, but I think about where one begins telling a story, and indeed where one considers a norm. So I was thinking about this both in terms of, and I'd love to hear a bit more about what you were saying about the UN after World War II actually as well, but maybe that would be another question. But the idea of borders, of when a border is considered original, if you see what I mean, when actually they're continuously in flux. But actually a similar point on what you said about sanctions later, and about whether we see ourselves as divesting, in other words, setting a norm as having been a particular way of conducting our economics, and therefore we're actively divesting, or whether we should see it as, actually reverting to what might have been a norm. Do you see what I mean? That where do we regard the beginning of a story, and therefore what we consider to be deviation from norm? Does that make sense? And if it does, yeah. Would you like to say something wise about that?
Yeah, there are a few questions in there, but there's a question of depth which I think I might struggle with. On the economic side, people criticize divestment because it seems to be penalizing. It seems to be taking something away. However, if we were to perceive economic exchange as a relationship between two entities, not necessarily between two individuals, but between two entities, and that relationship were to have some ethical quality to it, then divestment is a defense of your values if that relationship has become broken in such a way that your values are being challenged. There's always two sides to divestment. The argument for remaining invested is that you can continue to have a dialogue. And in any other sense of investment, in investment in a relationship, I would support continuing in dialogue. Difficulty is when we're talking about a relationship which is in economic terms, an economic exchange. Let's say, for example, the purchase of oil and gas from either Russia or from Saudi Arabia, which I think we have significant difficulties over, for example, their actions in Yemen at the moment. The difficulty of remaining invested in that relationship is actually, by remaining invested, you don't have any ability for an exchange. You don't have any influence necessarily. You have, if you like, the culpability without the capability for communication and dialogue. And those are the times I think that you need to think about divestment. And I think that we need to think about divestment, therefore, as a non-violent tool far more frequently than we do at the moment.
Thank you. I think we've got time probably for one more, and I see that David has his hand up.
Thanks, Helen, and many thanks to you, Steve. It was absolutely fascinating and very wide-ranging. And I was particularly interested, as you brought us towards the end, in terms of issues within the churches. And particularly, I'm interested in the Russian Orthodox Church, and to what extent there is diversity, but perhaps it's not being publicly expressed, or to what extent it's really the voice of Patriarch Kirill is representing a pretty unified view within the church. So invite you to offer any further insights that you have and extend some of the things you were saying in terms of what you feel is going on under the surface within the Russian Orthodox Church. Thanks.
Sure. Clearly, there is a diversity. There has been an open letter from, I think, about 170 Orthodox priests to Patriarch Kirill around the conflict and challenging the Orthodox view of the conflict. This, I think, is pretty radical. We haven't had a conflict previously where there has been so public a protest from priests within the Orthodox Church. So clearly there is diversity in views in the Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church in Russia is quite special. It is the state church, but more than just being the state church, it is part of Russian culture and identity. And therefore, the church is important not only to the church, but the church is important to the state. Putin has made that quite clear with his own personal relationship to the Orthodox Church as well. And so that difficulty of mix of church and state in the political culture of Russia is particularly difficult for Orthodox priests who will dissent from the Russian government view of the conflict in Ukraine. In short, there is diversity. We need and we should be praying for people in the Russian Orthodox Church. In terms of other churches in Russia, particularly Protestant churches, these many are like the Methodist Church in Russia is an indigenous church, is over 100 years old in terms of its presence in Russia, and yet is seen sometimes in the context of people in Russia as almost being like a form of sect and not essentially Russian or indigenous. And so many of the smaller churches are particularly vulnerable in their positions and maybe wouldn't be able to speak out in this conflict without there being some significant repercussions.
Thank you, Steve. I think we could continue this conversation for a long time, but we should keep our promises, and we have come to the top of the hour. So I'm going to draw us to a close here. Can we express our gratitude and thanks to Steve in the traditional way? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a delight to be with you to share some of my sort of emerging thinking around this. I realize I covered a lot of topics. I hope that it gives us a little bit to chew on and the conversation develops and continues.
Thank you. It's great. Those of you who have been with us for a while will know, or you may remember that we're recording these and pushing them on our YouTube channel. So I'm just putting a link there in the chat if you would like to catch up on any previous ones, for those who haven't been with us all the way along, or those who would just like to listen again, because they've been, I think, a really fascinating and quite diverse set of lectures. And our last one is next week. We're not going to have one on Maundy Thursday because I thought people would probably have their own services quite likely that they would want to go to. So the 6th lecture will be delivered by the Reverend Dr. Christopher Landau, and his title is Splashing Our Way to the Peaceable Kingdom, Facing Conflict with Foot Washing, Forgiveness and Neighbour Love. And I came across Christopher, I should say, because he's the author of the acclaimed book, A Theology of Disagreement, New Testament Ethics for Ecclesial Conflicts, which I really enjoyed reading earlier in the year. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing him speak, and I hope that you'll all join us for that at the same time and through the same book by Eventbrite as you have before. We've been closing each time by saying the grace to one another, and I've been encouraging people to unmute and embrace the slightly mad and slightly anarchic sense of time lapse, there's a time difference that we have when we do that. So if you feel like doing that, perhaps you'd like to unmute and let's just say the grace to one another, and actually let's hold, as Steve's been encouraging us to, let's hold our brothers and sisters in both Ukraine and Russia and across the world in our hearts as we say this. So we say together, may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all evermore.
Amen.
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 Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope to see you next week. And thank you once again, Steve.
Thank you.